Okay, so this is going to be an attempt at approaching a rejection of flow and causal. This is a live, but really it's just a video, so I'm not trying to get anybody to take a look, see, or anything um, until I post it. So the idea here is with flow and causal is something similar to the reason why abortion is wrong is somewhat similar to um, when you were if you were to push a child because you felt like it into a pool and they're drowning, you would seem that that would be wrong to not save them. So the idea is that with causal is that you did something to push the child into a pool, right? And or in this case, you had smacks. That's the pushing of the pool, and then you basically are now obligated to sustain them in order to uh, and give them birth because you put them in a state of dependency. Just the same, push the child into a pool, they're in a state of dependency. You have to do whatever's necessary to remove them from the pool. Um, and the thing that that does, though, is it bakes in a lot of pre deposition or prepositions as far as like this is now a being which is equal to you and I. So we would say that this child has sentience, it has a future like ours is that is actualizing, it has all the moral traits that we would generally recognize, and the direct action of pushing a child into the pool is, prima facie morally wrong to do, especially if you just did it because you were either negligent, i.e., taking some drinks, or you were just doing it because you're a jerk and you like to throw kids into a pool. Um, so what we're going to try to do is basically tear down the parsimony. So it's flow and causal is a very it can be a very parsimonious it hits our intuitions to start off with, but there's things that need to be considered as far as why at its face value such an example is like pushing a child into a pool feels wrong, and then it equating it to pregnancy for some reason that doesn't land correctly. And what we're going to try to do is understand why that doesn't land correctly. Because pushing child into the pool, that hits intuitions. The pregnancy element, there's something missing with that. Um, so we're breaking down the parsimonious nature of it into basically a state of incoherence. And we're going to try to trigger grounding requirements as far as why um, they are now obligated. What does it mean to have a flow? So creating much less like kind of an inductive case into an abductive case, which is like a state of probabilities versus like a direct cause and effect. Um, and that again weakens the argumentation. So um, the thing that we're going to try to do here is first also apply some sort of element of like there's a symbolic nature to this as well, in the fact that there's like a belief system of like a god typically in this argumentation, and there's this sort of extrinsic value that all life is sacred that's being applied here through sort of this deontic element, and finding and pulling that out of this argumentation as well kind of weakens it to them now having to prove God as far as what the belief system is. Now, usually, most will try to not admit to this element. They don't want to try to go down that route, which because it hurts most lives and it's very difficult to sit there and try to do. Um, Now, so most will give an exception of incest or grape, including those who are underage, and then also imminent life of the mother. So imminent life of the mother, that all those are things that you can use to kind of attack the argumentation. Um, because what does it mean to be graped? Why can uh, a child not consent? What does it mean to consent? What is imminent life of the mother? we have to have an opportunity to actually act on this. So as far as how imminent this threat is to the mother, uh, it may not even be um, a practical to address some kind of imminent threat. Um, just having gestational diabetes, or just having gestational diabetes, or just having even something like preeclampsia. All those things have to be proven out. And the other thing that we have to consider here too is things like, if we have something like a stillbirth, a lot of times that's not going to even be fully evaluatable until um, the 20 weeks. And so that puts into question, what is it? Is that still an abortion? What do you mean that this fetus is now deceased? How are you justifying that? What sort of rationale are you using? And you're putting additional like feasibility elements into assessments, and the practical nature of that, as far as they're giving up this exception, but how are they justifying giving this exception? And then how is that rooted out into the other elements of consideration that they're doing? Um, and I might have to take a couple of these videos because I'm not doing too great as far as making this concise. But so I mean, the first thing you're going to get into is like what constitutes as an obligation, right? So generally speaking, it's supposed to be you caused it, you own it. But indirect causalities may be a shared degree of responsibility. This is where things kind of get more opaque. And whether or not, let's say that you said, I only want to have sex with a condom, and then an individual takes that off, that also is now considered a grape. How do they handle that? Um, and so the other element is they'll typically pose some kind of counterfactual world. So you could propose, something to the effect of like why this invasion uh, is different than other invasions. And let's see if I can get to this. So yeah, sorry, the causal change of morality. So basically, um, what you're doing here is again creating this understanding of what is the direct or indirect causes. Now, the counterfactual world would be, if you didn't have SMEX, you wouldn't be pregnant. But uh, you could say that this is either some kind of accidental cause, and we could shift this. The other thing that we have to, another way to approach this too, is that we can be obligated to things that we don't have assigned value for, such as like, okay, maybe you went out and you bought some sunflower seeds, and you bought these sunflower seeds. Like, okay, I got some sunflower seeds, but you decided you wanted to go on vacation. So you go on vacation and you never plant the sunflower seeds. Come back, you forget about them. So the idea here is that just because you're obligated to something doesn't mean that you're obligated to a degree of value. So I can, it would be impractical for me to sit there and say I did something morally wrong by not planting these sunflower seeds, because I don't assign that thing a value. So now in this argumentation, they have to build why this is valuable. And typically you do this with flow, but we're going to look at that in a moment, which flow is a future like ours. But then you also have to prove out that this thing has a future like ours. This growing embryo, typically this is a point of fertilization for a lot, or conception. However, that's a weaker form of argumentation. The better form of argumentation is after implantation. And there's several different reasons for that we might get into here. Um, so there's also an element here where it's sort of epistemically inconceivable. So if you're going to say that you're obligated to something, if you do not have epistemic access to this obligation, meaning that you did something, let's say the doctor told you you're sterile. You have no possibility that you're going to get pregnant. This is what the doctor said. They told you this thing. So now you go out, you have sex, you do things, and you get pregnant. And you're like, this is not the time. This is not what I wanted to happen. You know, with this epistemic uncertainty, or even for that matter, if you took 16 different precautions, um, and you still had smacks, are you still obligated for this? And in this sense, it sort of goes into a butterfly effect of causality, where sure, if I throw a rock across a lake, maybe that makes a duck move, and maybe that duck does something, and then all of a sudden a plane of 100 people go down. It's like that just seems unforeseeable. Like there's no, it's not practical. It's not conceptually, epistemically accessible for those kind of events and that causal chain to result. In the same sense that if you do enough preventative actions, you could try to make the case for, that you don't have the epistemic access. You can't rationalize, something that has a 1 in a trillion chance versus 1 in 10 trillion chance. We can't even, like, at that level, that practical like nature, we lose our ability to conceptualize what is even the difference there, as far as actually taking an act that would otherwise be different. Um, as far as, if I go left, it's a 1 in a trillion, and if I go right, it's a 1 in 10 trillion. Which direction do I go? It really probably doesn't even matter, because even the slightest incentive to go one way or the other is the reason why you would make the choice, rather than a risk of this 1 in a trillion. Um, in the same sense that, like, when you're going for a drive in a car, there's like a 1 in 100 chance that you might get into uh, an accident within your lifetime, and as such, when you're driving with your friends, etc., they're also taking on that risk, but not necessarily have full epistemic certainty or comprehension of exactly what that risk might be, as far as a driver might come, no responsibility of their own, and they might get into an accident, and that is, are you then burdened because you were the driver, because you took them out, because you said you guys wanted to go to Six Flags, it was your fault? Like, that's where we can't put that chain of events uh, linked together. That, maybe that driver could have braked harder and had that other driver not hit them, but this is not something that we sit there and say it is your responsibility that you unalived the other people in the car, if you did some rational, reasonable protections. um so what you want to try to do is understand what their framework and how they define consent. So, what do they use as a consent framework? Usually, a consent says like free, voluntary. It's informed. It's affirmative and communicated, and it's ongoing, mutual, and the individual has a capacity to do this consent. So, there, all those areas are things that you can attack. Whether or not someone can be free of coercion. And this could say that, oh, like, I really want to do this. And someone, for whatever reason, there's, let's say, a power element where somebody's boss, that power dynamic, limits the kind of consent that you can do, because maybe you're trying to get hired for something. So your boss gets you pregnant. You didn't realize that that was going to be the result. Now you want an AB. Is that consentable? Because you could consider that coercion. Now, you could also sit there and say, again, with the informed element, the doctor tells you that there's no way you can get pregnant. It would be bad if you got pregnant. Maybe you have some other kind of risk that's involved, risk to the fetus that will develop a certain way that would be problematic for the fetus's health later on in life. That might be a high risk of anencephaly, or however you might cash that out. And you could sit there and say, well, okay, I did not do this informed. I didn't realize that I had this risk, or that my my spouse, the person I was engaging with, had this risk. We weren't informed from a DNA level until we got tested. So now we have this test. We didn't have this epistemic access. It seems unreasonable to have everyone test for genetic abnormalities in order to make sure that this is okay. So essentially, they never have the complete epistemic access to such an event, and that kind of risk profile. So therefore, really, a lot of SMEX is not actually informed, in the sense of all the things that we want to consider as far as how informed an individual wants to be. The other thing is if the other individual has never had smacks education or has never had this kind of access to information that is tangible, then they can say again, it wasn't fully informed. And if two people were on an island, and they had smacks, and they grew up on this island, and they were 8 or whatever, and somehow stayed alive, never had a father, never had a mother to teach them anything, and they engaged in smacks. The reality is that they would not end up really having epistemic access that you would actually could assign, okay, this individual who wants to end up, thank you, Wildfire, who actually ends up being pregnant, you can't fault them for doing something, let's say something crazy, which would be like, I have this thing that's growing inside me. This is scary. And they have sort of a body dysmorphia moment, and they end up doing sort of a pseudo surgery there. So that would be, or maybe eating something that would end up causing this pregnancy to end. You couldn't fault that person because, again, they don't have the epistemic access. They never knew that result would happen. Some people have a different kind of form of understanding. This is sort of the sort of rationalized versus empiricism. We'll get that into a sort of worldview element. This is supposed to just kind of capture some of the more general alignments with causality and rejection of flow. And then what we're going to go into is capacity of consent here now. So, like the idea is that a child can't consent. Would that then mean um, that someone who is taking any kind of substance, even one drink or two drinks, or however that you cash that out, maybe they uh, smoked a particular substance, um, and that can then impair their capacity. So if it's impairing their capacity to any extent, you then have to assign, well, what's the threshold that you assign? And then with something like a substance, you don't really ever really know. Like, as far as the drink, we have measurements and tests for that as far as level of impairment. But even things like how much they ate that day, etc., really goes into question what this person actually has the capacity to do. And when you also take into account the fact that the majority of um, unwanted pregnancies, it just over 50% or so, had within the last 3 months had taken some kind of substance. um, that kind of builds into this whole, well, okay, if they didn't have the capacity, then it's unconsenting. If it's unconsenting, then it falls into the grape. So usually a lot of pro-lifers will say, well, grape is falling into this 1% profile. Now, that 1% element is only as far as the law is concerned in a lot of cases. So it doesn't actually account for this consent element. All it says is basically this person was completely incapacitated and was able to get a great kit and prove out all this stuff with this really high level of requirements of information. So as a result, you could sit there and say, well, you're pleading to law on that. This 1% is not a measurement of a moral status. This is a measurement of simply on the basis of a law. So you're pleading to legality with this 1% measure. Now you could try to say, well, this is what we have epistemic data for. We have reason to believe, there's good evidence, that this is highly questionable data as far as on a moral claim. So you really need to have them try to cash that out further, because just saying it's 1% isn't right either. So particularly, and if they try to do the 1% and say, listen, I don't want to talk about grape charges because it's only 1%. Well, that would also mean that I don't want to have you talk about the third trimesters then, because that's only happening in less than the majority, 98% or so. Now, if you also bake into the fact that you know it seems to be less than about 10% of third trimesters are um, maybe something that is not medically necessary. Because if you look at sort of the risk rates of preeclampsia in there and other elements as far as like the fetus's deformities rates, etc., if you bake all those in and you sort of put that into into the risk profile towards the third trimester, especially with the testing discoveries that can only be done in the third trimester, you find good reason to believe that somewhere around less than 10% are occurring there. And usually, um, it is they're occurring in part because they didn't have access to it. So this individual had the intent of actually trying to get an AB earlier, didn't have access to it, so they had to end up in another state to go get that access. Maybe they were impeded by their spouse or significant, and um, they or a family member, and said, "No, I'm going to hold you here for 6 months because our state doesn't allow AB. So now that I have you, in the basement or something like that against your will, and now I'm only going to release you when you can't get an AB." So that would obviously fall into an account of, okay, well, is that allowed? Because that could be this other 10% that we're taking into consideration. It's also impractical to sit there and suggest that, okay, the only reason is because the person didn't want to. They just wanted to feel pregnant for this long. There's some small section of individuals who pretend that that's the case and whatever. But the thing that we're having to consider here is the fact that it's costly to get these ABs. It is costly, and not only that, it's psychologically really impactful to go through these kind of processes. So it doesn't make sense that an individual would do this, and just for the sake of, like, on an impulse. And that's also kind of part of my worldview that that we might get into a different live. But acting impulsively, or even out of fear, might be questionable as far as what sort of moral basis that you're using. And so you can catch that out saying, basically, if you're acting uh, impulsively and not in a rational mindset, or if you are allowing your own fear of coercion, or fear to coerce you into doing something, you could sit there and say, well, that was not necessarily a morally justified manner, but I'm not trying to sit there and say that those are morally justified because they weren't using good rationale. They weren't, built into a normative framework on that. So let's see here. So, yeah, again, when does these voluntary actions and what is your foreseeability threshold? Um, how serious does something need to be in order for you um, to be obligated to something? Are you obligated because to something like the sunflower seeds, not only for its value, because like you promised these sunflower seeds, you said use sunflower seeds, like I'm really going to plant you. And so therefore, are you, is that serious enough because you really committed to that? And were you uniquely positioned to help these sunflower seeds, or, versus anybody else? Nobody else had any possible access to these things. And then does how burdensome is this kind of help to these sunflower seeds? And those are things that we need to consider when we're thinking about causalities. Um, so the other element that you kind of go into is, people can consent to smacks, but not necessarily consent to pregnancy. As a result, you could say that this is not something that they consented to. As a result, you could try to cash out that it's not an obligation. It's a little bit of a harder case because it's an action which is kind of implied in that. So I'll leave it to you to try to cash out the non-consent to pregnancy element. I might try to get into that in another live. Um, so the other thing you consider here too is like, well, okay, if you give a grape exception, then also if someone has consenting smacks and then has unconsenting smacks within the same week, are they allowed or are they not allowed? Because to me, it could be either. So what's the foreseeability there? Are you still obligated? Because that could or could not be a consented smacked child. So that needs to take into consideration as well. Do you disagree with causality? Well, we'll see. So you don't have a consent framework, 11. So as far as I understand it, so it's just I'm trying to understand that framework, and I haven't seen it from you yet. But this is sort of a concern regarding how people cash out the obligation and the causality element. Um, so, and this is I would invite you up, but right now I'm just trying to run through a live to post. This might be incoherent. I might have to try it again. So I don't know. We'll see. Um, so let's see here. So the other element is, can somebody revoke consent in mid-session if they say, okay, I did not want you to end in SMEX. So if you don't sorry, end the smecks inside me. So if that's the case, then that's an outsized risk. That is clearly also a grape. Maybe that was implied, but not necessarily understood. But that could still be the case. So therefore, even if it happens, the person can get an AB. So I mean, again, this kind of beating a dead horse here, but self-motivated, enthusiastic. Just because somebody consents, says, okay, let's have SMEX, that doesn't mean necessarily that they are truly consenting. Usually, SMEX is considered consented to when it's self-motivated and enthusiastic, not coerced by the standards that might meet, let's say, a lot of unintended pregnancies, such as people just meeting up for the first time and somebody saying, "Come back to my place, let's just watch a movie," and then uh, actions happen, and it just seems to be this result that they allowed to happen, but they had difficulty speaking up against it. However, and so again, if you look at how many unintended pregnancies also have this sort of coerced element into it, you really go well over any kind of 1% dialogue. So, um, so also, what kind of being can consent? What makes them consent is something that you want to also try to get into, um, and making consideration as far as a deer doesn't consent. Is any kind of can they have ABs? What's I don't know. Yeah, however you want to try to navigate that. But again, there's something called the Fry rule of standard of evidence element as well, which some people go, well, if it adheres to the Fry rule of standard of evidence, this is how we can cash out what a unconsented or consented pregnancy is. But this is really difficult. You have to have the evidence. You have to be able to prove it out. You could sit there and say, oh, well, this is again. Uh, Probably not something that we can even ascribe to within a moral context. That's more pragmatic. Um, and this, again, builds out the whole notion that causality really questions if causal and flow are necessarily a pro-life conclusion. Um, So what we're also going to do here is challenge the prima facie wrongness of an AB. So I don't have a consent framework. What well, I have never. Sorry, 11. I don't. I haven't seen your consent framework. I don't know of it. I'm not saying you don't have it. It's my bad. Um, I'm just not aware of the consent framework that you use. Um, so as far as if a baby is has a 99 or 99.99% chance of being born over a meat grinder, um, can they have an AB? So obviously this should be the case. They should be allowed to have an AB, because the vast majority of pregnancies are going to end up with the vast majority of pregnancies are going to end up with the mother um, giving birth to a child over a meat grinder. So this would not imply a good future like ours. This would be a future for a minute, or even less, and it would be an agonizing future. So when you sit there and say, "Oh, it's wrong to abort a child because of a future like ours," if they're born over a meat grinder, uh, I would expect an individual to get an AB. Now, um, I don't know if it's you're morally obligated. Maybe you really value that 1 second that you get to see the fetus, but I value that 1 second that you get to see the fetus, but at the very least, it seems very permissible to have an AB if a baby is going to be born over a meat grinder. So I apologize for some of the misspellings here. It's just an AI sort of overview or sort of a breakdown of this. So kind of using this as a reference. Um, So, and the reason for why you would AB with a mother being, giving birth over a meat grinder is because obviously the pain is going to be a psychological pain. This is going to go through sort of a state of coming to consciousness. Uh, it's going to be visually very cruel and crude. And so it seems like a good idea to get the AB if the mother's born over meat grinder, especially if you say this is going to happen an infinite amount of times. You're going to have to watch this an infinite amount of times. So limiting that amount of infinite might be the case, or you could just say a trillion times because infinite, then the probabilities become inconsequential. Um, so the other thing that you need to ask an individual who's running these kind of argumentation is what does it mean to be a wrong for something to be wrong? You say that it's wrong to unalive someone with a future like ours, and in this case, a fetus. Why is it wrong? I mean, they can run hypothetical elements here. And they could try to ground it in that sort of the hypothetical, but it's important to understand what their meta-ethical commitments. So again, when we're trying to break down the coherence of this, uh, addressing the meta-ethical commitments that the individual has is fairly important. And then what makes the situation true? So this is some what's a truth maker, or the what makes these normative principles true? What's a truth maker, or the what makes these normative principles true? This is where you're probably going to end up with a situation where you have somebody talking about God and what their belief system is based off of. Some people use a sort of a natural law and a deity law element, and sort of they derive their morality from things like the Bible, etc. If their morality is derived from that, then you sit there and say, well, why is that the case? Why is the 10 commandments the thing that we need to follow? What makes this the natural case? And then you question the whole premise of religion, which you sit there and say, well, it seems to be that the reason why we have religion is actually because we've had difficulty grounding morality in society. So we needed religion to help us ground something, because otherwise we have this epistemic challenge where we go, why is anything right or anything wrong? And because we didn't have anything to solidify this is why we need religion, because religion gives us something to point to and everybody to say, hey, this is why things are wrong. It's because big man in the sky says this is the case. This is why wrong things are wrong, because you're not following these sort of religious commitments. So um, that's one of the ways you kind of get into that. So another thing is that is it always a good thing to get flow, right? So if a flow happens inside of the fallopian tube, we could say that that might be a bad thing, right? So if this flow is occurring in, uh, it could basically unalive a mother. So now again, they have to prove that a flow is always good. If it's not always good, then you kind of get into a little bit of semantics more so. And then what are the necessary properties to have a flow? Is it DNA based? Is it something being like, and don't you're supposed to not give them a bunch of ideas, but you just ask them very open ended questions and get them to run through. Like, does a fly shaped human have a flow? If this thing is injected with a flow, it has human DNA, all these other traits. It just doesn't have the anthropomorphic traits. It can't communicate. So basically, a mute fly gets born from a woman. A mute fly gets born from a woman, and it supposedly has a future like ours because it has it has a flow. So doesn't have a future like ours? Well, I'm stipulating it has a future like ours. And say, well, how do you stipulate that it has a future like ours? It's a fly. Okay, well then it seems like I don't understand what a future like ours actually means. Can you elaborate? Um, and so does something that is always unconscious, and so does something that is always unconscious have a future like ours? So something that's born to a vegetative state, is that a future like ours? So it would seem then the only thing that they might be able to do. So it would seem then the only thing that they might be able to do is kind of exist. Um, and that might be questionable. Does an anencephaly baby, who is most likely think that has a flow, um, and does a something with the brain of a fly. So this now also goes in the other element of challenging the anthropomorphic nature of it. So this fly comes out of a woman, right? So and the brain is that of a fly. It acts like a fly, everything else. However, it looks like a human. There's all the anthropomorphic traits, but it's trying to be a fly. Is it wrong to unalive that fly? Is it wrong to unalive that fly entity? It's not a rational kind. It's da da da. What makes it wrong? Because it would seem that the reason why it's wrong is because it's from the origin of the mother, but that's just kind of pleading to that element, maybe, and you can kind of get into that sort of nature. When does a baby or anyone stop having a flow? That would be something. And then what baby or anyone stop having a flow? That would be something. And then what makes it stop having this flow? What holds the flow together? And if so, you would need to understand that element, and do something like, well, does Superman have a flow? Certainly doesn't have a future like mine, in the sense that he does a lot of things that I don't do. So um, then you kind of get into like what is the predicated requirements of the entity to have flow? Again, like we talked about earlier. Um, Again, what makes a flow being of either like many will say something to the effect of like, it's the be of a rational kind. What does that mean? Why is that significant to be of rational kind? That's sort of an Aristotelian approach. Um, and you can kind of get them to that argumentation, as well as like, well, okay, so who or what bestows this flow? So we have flow. Where do we get it from? And they might say it's like, well, it doesn't matter. I don't care where it comes from. It's just they have this thing. It's like, well, it doesn't matter. I don't care where it comes from. It's just they have this thing. They seem to have this thing. Well, it could be morally important to see how they get this flow. Is it bestowed by God, and then so if so, like, what's the argument that God bestows this? When does God give you this flow? And that kind of gets into that a bit as well. So, is it something that's like biblically written that we have this flow? Like, oh, like write it like a future like ours. Like, how is this? How do they cash out? Then you kind of go back as well. So, is this is a little further back here, as far as a sperm, does a sperm have flow? What is the probability of it having a flow? Is that significant? We're going to sit there and probably say no, it doesn't have flow. Then you can kind of go through that. Uh, so that's like okay. This is actually a good one that they've come up, that some pro-choicers have come up with. I like that is basically a rock in a conveyor belt. This rock is coming along, and it's going to get a flow. I push the rock over. Did I do something morally wrong? It was gonna get a flow. Didn't have a flow yet. It's a rock. And I pushed it. I stopped it from being on this conveyor belt. So because it would, I'm depriving it of a flow. So again, the argumentation here with flow is that it's a deprivation harm. It's something that you would get in full actualization. So um, if you deprive a rock of getting a flow on a conveyor belt, then you're depriving it of a flow in the same sense that you're depriving a fetus of a flow. At least that's the point here. And such that they would then need to cash out this whole element of why does this flow occur and what continues and perpetuates this. Um, Someone says that it's a category error. And we can get into that. So again, as you can see, a lot of pro-lifers have a certain element of rejections to these, but I'd like to see some better argumentation from pro-choicers, like this, and possibly even better. So, but this is supposed to be an element to where we can address the parsimony nature of flow and create better argumentation regarding around and a better explanation as far as and rationale. So really pull out the worldview of a lot of pro-lifers and call into question exactly what they're trying to execute on and what's the moral basis here. I don't think anyone wants to irrationally or impulsively end the life of babies. And unfortunately, a lot of pro-choicers seem to kind of go that route once they're baked into a corner. And I don't think that's actually indicative of their mindset. That would generally be considered as maybe Link would say, hiya, morally wrong, and a complete crash out. So we want to really make sure we try to avoid putting the pro-choice community in a position of complete moral deptitude. Um, and we want to have more justifications around and hopefully gain a sense of common ground of why these things are important, when these things are important, and maybe we can get more of the pro-choice community um, to come to a standard of maybe causal flow and sentience. And if they were to do causal flow and sentience, we would probably get to a point where they would be for 98% of ABs. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm okay with that. So I think that seems to be a good compromise there because it seems to be where the most normative strength and the most uh, you know, unquestionable nature can be in. But the pro-life community does not agree. We'll see if we can make them agree. Not make them, not coerce them, bring them to the side. And as Link had said, bend the knee, but he was saying bend the knee for the pro-life or yeah, for the pro-life. We don't want to do that. All right, well, that's going to be my breakdown. I'm going to try to post this. It's kind of a rambling schmandering, but I'm not going to do that on anybody else's live except for my own, as best I can avoid. As you can see, there's a lot of different misspellings here. I'll try to run through. Like, oh, okay, symbolic nature. I'm going to read off as basically there are things that are symbolic that we ascribe moral value to. Like we wouldn't make someone eat a pig if it's against their religion. Now, you could say that it may not be morally wrong to eat a pig, but I think most would agree it's morally wrong to force someone to go against their religion. And this is symbolic in nature because you could make argumentation that, anything can be religiously followed. And if that's the case, then you get into the semantic element or subjectivity. So I'm unwilling yet. So I'm unwilling yet to address how symbolic nature actually comes into account for a moral belief. So I think most comes into account for a moral belief. So I think most things which are symbolic are probably not normative. But I would agree that, like something like ending the life or having a dignified death, right? Dignified unaliving. Um, that would be something we agreed to. But how that is actually done is culturally ambiguous. So this is one of the reasons why I'm a relaxed realist, and hopefully we can address that at another point. I am hoping that some of these things can kind of help individuals. Uh, I will almost certainly be reposting something because this is a bit of a meandering. But uh, let's hope this does somebody good. All right. Have a good night, everybody.